Hey, welcome back to Pro Studio Live. We are in our last segment of our EQ episode. I'm here with Ian Sutton, and in this segment, we're going to be talking about things you want to avoid with EQ and common mistakes, common problems that you may encounter in your own mixes. So let's kind of start off with bass frequencies, something that I commonly, far and wide, hear many people talking about, the bass being the hardest of the frequencies to kind of take control over in your mix. Do you agree? Do you disagree?
I absolutely agree. Completely. Bass, it's the hardest to get right for many different reasons. A few of those reasons I feel are, I think we mentioned it earlier, there's lower actual musical notes within the bass octave or the bass the bass range. So musically, you've got less note values to work with. Things have to fit there in less with less note values and less actual frequencies. The other thing that makes bass so hard is the areas we listen to things in. Most of us do a little bit of mixing in a bedroom or a very imperfect room, and they have, those imperfect rooms have bass buildups and bass drops all over the place. Chances are, if you have your speakers against the wall and you're sitting in the middle of the room, there's a big bass drop at anywhere 60, 70, or 80 hertz right in the middle of your room. So, or if you're in the corner of a bedroom, there's probably a huge bass build, like there was in the corner of my living room where I used to mix at, a huge bass build at 120 hertz. So I would always cut that, and I'd go out in the car and I'd be like, "This sounds terrible. Like, where's the upper end of my kick drum? It's gone," because my room lied to me. Yeah. So I'd say unless you are mixing at a facility like Signature Sound, like other studios, chances are your room is lying to you, and you're going to grab an EQ. That's the first thing you'll do. Grab an EQ to try and fix it. Well, you're probably not really fixing it. You're probably just making it worse. Or there's a good chance that you're making it worse. So bass is really, really tough to get correct. Maybe you'll throw on some headphones. But again, bass is really tough for headphone manufacturers to get right.
True.
It's either usually too bassy or not bassy enough. So with bass, we say, well, try and mix in a great room if you can. But most of us don't have that option. So listen to a lot of music in the space that you're working in. Know where the deficiencies of your mixing area, know what deficiencies those have. Excuse me. It's even good to go get like a frequency analysis. There's software out there. I think IK Multimedia makes a room analysis kit. It comes with a microphone, and you can put a little corrective EQ there.
Okay.
That's sort of okay, but Room EQ Wizard actually is a free program.
Okay.
And I use that at my little home mixing studio. I went out and bought a DBX measurement mic, and I downloaded Room EQ Wizard. I set the microphone there in my mix position, and it plays, whoop, these blips out of each speaker, and it gives you a readout. And I go, oh, okay, cool. So there's actually a big bass boost at 40 hertz in my room in my mix position.
Oh, wow.
And so I think about that when I'm mixing in that room. So that helps out a whole lot. So know what story your room is telling you. If it's fibbing a little bit, or if it's telling you like the truth.
Yeah, man, that's super important. I spend a lot of time mixing and editing for the clients that I work with in my bedroom, but I try to save the commitment decisions for when I'm in the studio because of that reason. The listening environment is ultimately what is going to tell us what we need to know. And if you're in a room that's lying to you, you're going to be producing something that's not necessarily true. And these are subjective terms, lying, truth, that's all up in the air, but the listening is super important, the listening environment. I can definitely tell plenty of stories about how I've been in a concert venue and I stand in one area of the room and man, the bass is thumping, I feel it all through my body, and then I step one step over and I don't feel anything. The bass is almost gone. So I'm sure we've all experienced, either consciously or not, when you have a bass dropout or a bass buildup in a room, and that's incredible. Sometimes I don't even think about that when I'm mixing.
It's one of those things you probably don't think about very often,
Yeah.
but if you want to geek out, there's some really cool things you can do too. I mean, you can play a bass frequency out of your signal generator, like I did in Pro Tools. I've got a free analysis software on my phone. It'll give me a dB readout.
Cool.
So I play 60 hertz, and I just walk around my room and watch that meter go up and down and up and down.
I have one of those too.
And, yeah, it's pretty. That's what we do. So bass is one of the hardest things. So try not to make huge moves in your bass with EQ, because if you're in a room that's not, acoustically sound, chances are you're trying to fix a problem that's not really there.
Now, something that I've kind of been working with in my more recent projects, I mean, everything within the last year or so, instead of like going to an EQ to boost a certain frequency, say in the kick drum, I'll try to hear that frequency that I want in the kick drum in the bass guitar and try to use that as almost a change in relationship, give more of the bass guitar instead of EQing that in the bass drum, because I might be in a room that's lying to me and the kick drum feels hollow or something, and that's not quite true. I don't know, experiment with different non-EQ procedures to see if that might help you get the sound without going to the EQ, especially with the bass frequencies. That's the hardest, I think. What's this graph that you have pulled up on your computer screen?
This is actually the graph. This is Room EQ Wizard. It's a free program.
Oh, perfect.
It's Mac or PC, so don't be afraid if you're on a Mac and
And you can find this if you Google search Room EQ Wizard.
Room EQ Wizard, yeah.
Perfect.
So this is a graph of my room. It looks really bad, but actually it's gotten better. So I did a bunch of treatment, and here's different positioning. So here is, I made some homemade tube traps. So I put the tube traps in, and then with a sub on, you can see there's this big boost right there at right about 40 hertz. And then I moved some things around. I just changed my speaker position and then reshot the room, and it totally made a difference. I initially when I set up my room, the speakers, I was like, that looks great. And then I shot the room, and it didn't. I was like, well, what if I move the speakers around? Would it sound better? So I moved the speakers in, moved them back towards me a little bit, moved my mix position, and it sounded a lot better. It's really amazing what like a foot or two can do in your room. This is, like I said, a free program. The mic is about $100 for a good flat measurement mic. Test out some different spots in your room. That will help your low frequency so much in your mixes. I guarantee that will really, really help out.
So, I mean, you're having trouble with your bass frequencies, go out, get a measurement microphone, get this Room EQ Wizard, spend a couple hours in your room listening, and $100 out, and you can increase so much just by not even reaching for an EQ at that point. You're just kind of moving things around and listening environment. You're affecting the listening environment. That's radical. That's awesome.
And you can go do it for your friends and charge them $100, make that money back for the mic.
There it is. There it is. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, metaphorically and literally, what's a common problem in the high end, the upper range of frequencies?
They're too sweet.
Yeah.
We all like to hear really crisp and clean sounds, and I think with the high frequencies, the problem I run into the most is adding too much, and then listening for too long, and then your ears get a little fatigued, and it doesn't sound as crisp and clean and as sweet. So you go in and, like I said, remember, I'm always going back and changing things, updating things, and I'll go back and that really does need a little bit more high end on it, a little more high end there, a little bit more high end here, and by eighth hour of a mix, if you haven't taken a break or used a reference track, you've added too much high end. Because it's really easy, and if you're soloing and not listening to the mix, it's really easy to try and make everything sound real sweet. And that high frequencies, just sweetens things up. So it's the problem with high frequencies is it's really easy to overdo it and add too much.
I'm definitely guilty of doing that on far too many occasions. I get caught up and I want to make things sound like $1 million, and by itself it may sound like $1 million, but I mean, you drive a Ferrari in traffic and you're still in traffic. You still need to keep account of what's going on with everything. That's very interesting. So what about mid-range, where everything is just sitting in this big room? You get clutter, you get things fighting over each other. Aside from separation and things outside of EQ, what are some common mistakes or things that you can remember doing that you probably wouldn't do now that maybe you did before for the mid-range?
Mid-range is one of those kind of, I don't want to say confusing, but mysterious lands because everything kind of lives in the mid-range. Our ears as humans, we are attuned to really hearing the mid-range more clearly than anything else. So a lot of times we go into the mid-range and we EQ things down a little bit. But it's really easy to overdo it and cut out the fundamental or cut out a frequency that's very important to that instrument in the mid-range. So finding out, really taking the time and exploring the instruments that need to have their bass in the mid, or not their bass, but they need to live really solidly in the mid-range. Exploring each one of those instruments and where they need to fit in the mix is what's really important with the mid-range. I feel like, and a lot of times, a little bit of cut at 700 hertz can make it sound like you boosted 1K. Instead of going through and boosting, maybe do a little bit of cut, or do a little boost and a little cut instead of a big boost. Because with EQ, I don't think we mentioned this, but additive EQ, when you actually boost EQ, that is where you can get into some problems with phase discrepancy, where things sound muddy and cloudy and foggy. So a lot of times with EQ, especially in the mid-range, to keep things clear and concise, a little bit of cut is going to be better than a boost.
So that actually brings me to a really interesting topic. When I was starting out as an engineer, I would get my hands on stem files all over the internet, royalty-free. My friends would give me their old sessions, whatever, and I would practice mixing. And I would do certain things, and then I'd show people, and then they would always come back to this topic, and I can't say that I ever really agreed with it, and I can't say that I do now, but they would mention you boost with a colorful or musical EQ like a Neve 1081, Neve 1073, API 550, what have you, and you would cut or be surgical with a graphic EQ or one of the AVID 7 bands or a Waves Renaissance EQ. What are your thoughts on that statement, where you boost with a color EQ and you cut with a digital EQ or a graphic EQ?
I think it's probably a good rule.
Okay.
Or a good, not a rule, but a good set of guidelines to follow most of the time. I think that with those kind of analog model EQs, as long as it's a good model, boosting is going to give you probably less artifacts than boosting with a digital EQ.
Okay.
And then again, with those analog EQs, they're a bit more musical. They're typically, if it's a parametric, the frequencies are kind of set out for you in fairly musical frequencies. So if you're boosting those are the things you want to keep. You might use those parametric like an API to keep boosting those certain musical frequencies.
Okay.
Another thing about the cool thing about like the APIs, because they are stepped frequencies, is as long as you're going to stay on the steps anyway, but then you can really make sure that you cut at this step on this instrument and don't boost at that step on another instrument.
True.
Or boost
True.
at that exact spot.
True. I've actually done that exact technique in a couple of my mixes for the last handful of years. It's not necessarily something that I always do, but I find myself every now and then I'll have my kick drum on an API 550 or something. I'll have 80 hertz or the closest denomination, and I'll notch down 2 decibels on the kick drum and notch up 2 decibels at the same place on my bass guitar.
Perfect.
And it kind of creates a small space for it to live in. But I mean, that might work for me. It might work for you. Who knows? It's just kind of experimentation or finding out what works and what doesn't. But that also does kind of spark another question in my mind about when to cut and when to boost in a tracking scenario. When you're working with the commitment factor, what do you find more applicable in your use? I mean, you've been engineering for a number of years. How has your philosophy on that changed over time, and what are you doing now that you might not have been doing before?
Well, I definitely EQ a lot more than I used to. I used to be a little bit scared, didn't want to mess stuff up, worry about it in the mix. That was my philosophy when I first started. And then I got more comfortable with equalization and EQ, and I'm like, wow, we need to be cutting out all the lows on anything that's not a kick drum or a bass instrument. All of a sudden, that helps out. That helps, it makes the rough mix sound great. And in relation to if you didn't do that. So I definitely cut. I use a lot of cuts when I track. If I know that the instrument isn't going to have any business living in a certain area, I'll just take that out. I'll cut that stuff out. I do want to be careful though, because I'm always thinking ahead to the mix. How is this going to fit in the mix? So if you have any kind of questions about it, don't do it.
Right.
But it's
that's a good rule to follow.
But it's also kind of exciting just to commit.
Oh yeah.
Just to
there's a little bit of thrill in doing something you're not quite sure is going to end where you want it, but within reason, of course.
And like I think we mentioned, when I do tracking, I use kind of broad strokes. So I might go to like a Neve or an API and just bump up a couple dB, right around the presence frequencies, between 1 and 5K, or on the cymbals, maybe boost up, 10 or 12K, just a few dB. So I'm not making huge moves when I track with EQ, typically, but more broad moves that go over more frequencies, but less boost of those frequencies.
EQs are so fascinating to me because I've heard records that have very little to no EQ that sound phenomenal, and that's just a testament to how it's tracked, the instrumentation, the arrangement, all of the other factors. But then I've also heard albums that are drenched in EQs, where there may be a Neve followed by an API, followed by a Renaissance EQ, followed by this, followed by that, and it just sounds absolutely amazing. So there's no real rule to being, you must be modest in your EQ. You must be very direct with how much you're doing. And what works, but it all just kind of comes back to what needs to happen. Am I wrong in saying that?
Nope. Absolutely. What does the song need?
Yeah.
What basically the big thing is looking at what you have, where you're starting out at, and where you want to end up at. What do you need to do to get it there?
Right.
Is EQ the right tool, or is moving the microphone the right tool? Yeah. But.
Now, on that topic, moving microphone placement, let's say you are in a tracking environment, right? What are some common techniques in microphone placement that may replace EQ moves? Say, for instance, you're miking a snare drum with an SM57, and it sounds too dense or thick in the bottom end. Most people's initial response would be go to an EQ, turn it down. what could you do instead to kind of give the snare drum a little bit more breath, a little bit more life, rather than so dense and thick sounding?
Move it away, maybe.
Okay.
Move it. If you're close, maybe pick it up off the head a little bit. Move it back off. Man, I haven't had a whole lot of good luck moving it off the rim.
Okay.
But I mean, who knows? Someday there'll be a snare drum where I pull it off the rim and it sounds great.
I've definitely recorded a snare drum where
Yeah.
the rim was about here, going this way, and I had the microphone about this far off of the rim,
Yeah.
and it sounded great. It had tons of like that crack sound that it just sounded like he was hitting it with a sledgehammer, and I didn't even know where it was placed because I had an assistant on the session, and he had headphones, and I said, just move it back, move it back, move it back. Just keep it there, it sounds great.
Nice.
And then I went into the room and I saw it, and it just blew me away. But at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily matter about what you think you know about mic placement or what is conventional. It sounded good, and that meant that it is good, because that's the ultimate test, right?
That's the
If
rule.
it sounds good, it is good.
That is definitely the rule.
That's fascinating. What are some crazy mic placement things that you've done in the past instead of moving to an EQ? Can you recall anything?
I mean, using like a dynamic microphone and putting it very close to the sound source is going to give you more that proximity effect. It's going to give you more bass, more bottom, more body.
Where is usually, in your experiences, the proximity effect most found on? If we're talking numbers here, what frequencies does the proximity effect, that's constantly talked about all over the internet? Everyone's talking about proximity, but what is that?
That's I'm going to say it's like 100-ish,
Okay.
100 and below, somewhere around there. I haven't actually thought about the exact frequency of proximity effect for a while, but it's below 100-ish. That's kind of what I recall, what I remember it being. So, yeah, if you need to get more body, more 100 hertz, grab a dynamic and move it closer to that sound source. You're probably going to get it.
Dynamic microphones aren't the only microphones that experience this proximity effect, correct?
Cardioid.
Okay.
Cardioid microphone.
Cardioid microphones.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, if you have a 414, put it in cardioid, put it right up next to something more bass.
Would an omnidirectional microphone have any sort of similarity to a proximity effect, or is it strictly cardioid because of the way that the polar pattern
Strictly
interacts?
cardioid because of the polar pattern. Yeah, an omnidirectional microphone is going to maintain a flatter response.
Okay.
I mean, it may just be louder because you're right next to the thing. But,
True.
Yeah.
But it's not going to be picking up so much of that
Nope.
lower end.
Nope.
Interesting. That's fascinating.
And then also with miking, I mean, typically, moving further away from the instrument is a lot of times going to reduce the body of it. Depends on the room, of course.
Right.
I mean, acoustics is all depends on the room that you're in. But just changing the placement around the instrument. Like on an acoustic guitar, if you put it right in front of the sound hole, like it's gonna be boomy. If you put it all the way up on the 4th or 5th fret, it's gonna be stringy.
Yeah.
I mean, move the microphone around the instrument. That's the best. That's really the best kind of EQ when you're recording live instruments.
Another thing that I've had great experiences with is multiple miking, where, say, for a guitar cab, I mentioned this in the last segment, one of my favorite combinations is a Shure SM57, which is a dynamic microphone, and a Sennheiser MD421, which is also a dynamic microphone. But the two of them almost sound completely opposite of each other, where the SM57 is very bright and harsh, has a lot of bite, and the MD421 is very warm and almost, for lack of a better word, soothing sounding. It makes almost anything you put it on sound great, but it's missing a lot of that bite, source dependent, of course. So when I'm miking a guitar cabinet, I put both of them together, and I find myself using less EQ on the guitar in the box, or even tracking on the way in, and just kind of messing with the blend of the level of the two microphones. Is that something that you might do in a tracking session or even in a mix scenario, you don't need to have control over the microphones. Would you go to reach for the blend of a multiple mic'd source before EQing it?
Oh yeah, especially if they had, the multiple miking was different tones, tones, from mic A to mic B. Oh yeah, that's probably the first choice.
Okay.
And there's other things too, like there's plugins out there that emulate rooms.
Oh, okay.
So I know Ocean Way has a UAD plugin that emulates their room, and you can put the microphones really close, the virtual microphones close to the virtual instrument in this virtual room, and it changes the tone like almost like you threw an EQ on it.
Wow.
So there's there's some other things out there that you can do before EQ.
That would kind of be simulating a microphone placement maneuver rather than an EQ maneuver if you don't have control over that sort of situation.
Yep.
That's fantastic.
So
one thing on the topic of guitar microphones, there's a microphone technique that incorporates phasing and the inconsistent, well, I guess the relationship between an on-axis mic and an off-axis mic, that it blends because they're so close together and they're not necessarily pointed the same way, there's a phase interaction.
yeah.
And that kind of takes away some of the bite. The common technique is to use two SM57s, which are both very aggressive, harsh-sounding microphones. So when you put them together, they kind of cancel out a little bit of the harshness and leave a much sweeter response. Have you done something like that, incorporating something that is on-axis and off-axis, or something similar to create this out-of-phase, deliberately out-of-phase mic placement? The words are failing me right now.
I haven't actually experimented with that. I mean, I've taken 257s and put them just the head off.
Okay.
But no, never tried to recreate that with the on-axis, off-axis. I'm going to try that next time.
Yeah, it's a fascinating technique. It's really difficult to get right, but they make mic clips now with like 3D printers and stuff. It's pretty cool. Pretty cool stuff that's coming out now with the internet and technology and stuff. So let's talk for a moment about referencing tracks. I've heard people talk about using pink noise as a reference. They've been mixing for like 3 hours and they're just, my ears are shot. So I'm going to play this track. I'm going to play this tone. I've heard people run a tone generator at 800 hertz and they'll just mute everything else, listen to 800 hertz, clear their palette, and then come back to the mix. Or sometimes it's pink noise, sometimes it's white noise. What do you do for referencing, and how do you use referencing to help you make EQ decisions?
I'm not afraid to say I use tracks that have been released. I use reference tracks. I mean, I depending on the style of music that I'm mixing, I will. I have a plugin called Magic AV.
Okay.
And it allows me to load in like 5 or 6 different tracks, and A/B between them really quickly on my master fader. So I will use different tracks that are in the same genre that I'm working with.
Okay.
Because each genre has its, different genres have different kind of what's accepted in that genre for how crisp it should be, or how much low end there should be. So, and I do a lot of mixing between different genres. So it helps me to have, reference tracks loaded up for the different genres that I'm working with.
Right. I try to work with reference tracks often too for the same reason, just because I want to be conscious of what other people are hearing. And not only am I doing this I'm an artist, I'm a musician, I love to do this, and this is my form of self-expression, but not only that, this is my business and it's my career, so I want to make sure that what I'm doing will in turn be competitive in the market. So not only does it give you that advantage of hearing what other people are expecting, so to speak, but it also kind of gives you a frame of reference as far as where your instrumentation should be sitting. I mean, granted, that's a very, very loosely used term. I'm not saying go to a reference track and copy it. Do what you're gonna do, because that's your goal. That's what you're being hired for. It's your taste. You're mixing engineering. You're gonna make your decisions. But that's good insight. How do you use frequency analyzers when mixing? Do you use them at all anymore in this point in your career?
You know, I do once in a while. It's the last time I used one, like, really seriously, maybe a couple months ago.
Okay.
I just couldn't seem to get things right on a mix, and it was a mix that was a more like cinematic,
Okay.
Electronic orchestral thing, but it also had some interesting, like, big kick drums and big elements like that. But then, some more digital strings and some things like that. And I just couldn't. Wasn't a genre that I normally mix, and so I found something else that was similar, that genre. And then I had a frequency analyzer, and I would go back and forth, and I was like, oh, yeah, what I thought wasn't really, it wasn't doing what I thought it was doing. And the frequency analyzer kind of allowed me to see some deficiencies that I hadn't picked up. And this was for a track that was going to be released as like a TV music, things like that. So it definitely had to kind of fit with other things like it. So that was, that helped out a lot, actually.
Do you ever remember when you may have been first starting out using an analyzer to identify certain problem frequencies, problem areas, things of that nature?
Oh, sure. Just like we did with the vocal and the guitar earlier. It was really easy to see that, that bump it right 3K.
Would you consider that a valuable tool to help you hear frequencies and understand what should be where?
Absolutely. I mean, it's learning frequencies and training your ear training. That's a whole other thing. Learning how to recognize what frequency you're hearing, it takes years and years and years. And having an analyzer there can really help kind of connect the dots there.
Okay. That's a good way to put it.
I wouldn't totally trust an analyzer, because the way we hear, also we hear in average levels, not peak levels. A lot of analyzers are peak analyzers.
Okay.
So something may look funny on an analyzer, but it sounds all right to you. So it's really hard to say there's a rule like, if it looks funny on an analyzer, trust it. It's not like flying a plane where you trust your equipment all the time. I mean, here, when you're flying the mix, you got to trust your ears.
Yeah.
But the analyzer can help if there's some questions here and there. So
that kind of brings something else up. We were mentioning earlier in the break room about arrangement and how arrangement of the song plays into your EQ decisions. I kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier when I was talking about mixing for the money maker. You want to spend time really getting to know the music that you're working with, just to make sure that you're making the right choices as far as what should be going to the attention of the listener. How important do you think it is to have a well-arranged song before you even get to the mix?
It's gonna be really hard to mix a song that's arranged poorly.
I agree.
The arrangement's a big deal. I mean, if you have, within the frequency spectrum, everything has to fit. Everything has to have its own place. If your arrangement has huge guitars playing over the guitar solo, there's not going to be enough space for that guitar solo to live and to be present and to have its own distinct place. So the arrangement is a huge deal. But it's also, I've gotten bad arrangements to mix, and you kind of want to balance that. How well do you know the artist? How well are they going to be? Are they going to be receptive to your thoughts on maybe changing the arrangement so the mix will fit a little bit better? That's a tough call.
So hypothetically, if I was somebody who didn't have enough clout as an engineer to make those kind of suggestions to the people that I'm working with yet, and I was just given a track that was poorly arranged, what might you give me as far as advice? What might you tell me that would help me kind of go about that process? You know, I know that there are probably more people, well, I can't really say that, but I'm sure there's a number of people out there that are working with not so well-arranged tracks that still have to mix it and are still, you know, they still have a responsibility to the clients that they're working with to provide a good quality product. What might you suggest?
It's going to be really subjective.
Right, right.
You know, I've had that, you know, have that happen many times, a few times, and your relationship with the client is first and foremost. You have to look at that relationship. You got to kind of think about them too. Are they, can they handle some criticism? And maybe don't even drop it off like criticism. Like, hey, I just can't get this section to work right. Is it possible? Can you, if we had to get rid of one of these instruments or had to make this one stand out more than the other one, which would you choose? Maybe drop it off to the client like that.
Okay.
Like, I really love both parts, but they're both not working together. Is it possible that we can, you know, tuck one of them back, or just do it and give them an alternate mix?
Yeah.
Say, hey, here's the mix, you know, like you had asked me to do it. However, when I was mixing it, I had a really hard time getting these things to work well together. I went ahead and did an alternate just to see if it's okay with you, if you like it. Tell me what you think.
Making a second mix is what you're proposing.
Yeah.
Just have something of your own idea, but also giving them what they are expecting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, you know, giving them choices. You know, hey, I tried to do what you want to do, because they're ultimately, as an engineer, they are the artist.
Right.
They didn't hire me to help arrange it.
Right.
They hired me to help mix it. So some artists get really touchy about their stuff. Like, no, I'm emotionally tied to both of those pieces. Well, then, you know, if you've tried as an engineer and they've denied your professional advice, then that's on that. At that point, that's on them. You've tried to let them know that you think it might be good and better, sound better a certain way, but don't. Ultimately, what they say goes. Really, for most of the work that I do. Yeah. So I never try to bully them into what I think is going to work better. I will make suggestions. Try to have them listen to those suggestions, and then let them make the decision.
Yeah, I got to tell you, I'm a firm believer in that. What I do, I mean, I can't speak for every audio engineer or mix engineer or whatever, but what I do is so much of them. I see myself as an artist's artist.
Yeah.
They come to me to help them create their art, and I try to hold that very, very highly in how I do my business. So I really agree with what you're saying. You know, it's their music, and we're hired to be facilitators of that. I had a great question. I can't remember. Oh, this is a little bit more of an advanced. I don't know if it's really more of an advanced technique, but it's a little out there. I sometimes, when I'm not really getting the sound that I want from a source, I'll create a mult of it, and I'll duplicate the track a number of times, and almost multi-band EQ or multi-band process these things. Most commonly, I do this with bass guitar. I work a lot with metal and rock and punk music out here in San Diego, and there's a lot of focus on bass elements, and I found that what works for me is focusing on the bass guitar. So yeah. I'll split it out. Do you ever find trouble in doing something like that?
I like to do the same thing too on a bass guitar. When the bass guitar has to fill up the low end, and it's also got to act as a kind of a percussive element on the higher end. Right. Compressing them together as one sometimes is really problematic. So splitting them in two, processing them together, and then bringing them together, or processing them separately, then bringing them together, really helps out quite a bit. I've noticed some weird little phasey issues sometimes in the crossover frequencies.
Me as well.
And it's sometimes spreading them out helps, sometimes pushing them together helps. Every instrument is different. but I've noticed that sometimes changing my crossover frequency really helps out because there can be some weird little artifacts in there. And that's, again, EQing is using phase shift to create the boosts and peaks in the frequencies. And when you have two of the same exact signal, and at that crossover frequency, they're just slightly out of phase, you get some muddiness and murkiness in there. That's what I've noticed.
Yeah, I agree. Something else on that same topic of kind of not weirder, just a little bit different approaches to EQing is here on Pro Studio Live, we had a guest with us a while ago named Daniel Ford, and he was very firm about this idea of dynamic EQing, where he would use a multi-band compressor on one band and only EQ once the source reaches a certain threshold in that specific region. What are your thoughts on approaching EQ in that manner? Whereas just broadband, I'm going to remove 2,000 hertz for the entirety of that point.
I love dynamic EQs or single band compression,
right.
However you want to put it, on certain things like vocals. I think they can really help out certain vocals. They don't work for me on drums because typically a snare drum is a snare drum no matter how hard you hit it, right?
Yeah.
It's still, you're not going to go different notes.
There won't be buildups in different regions of the frequency spectrum.
Exactly. Probably not.
If there is, I'd like to find out how that happened and make a song that way.
For vocals, I do use dynamic EQ or multi-band compression or single band compression in vocals quite a bit at like between 1 and 5K. Okay. On a lot of vocalists, you'll get that weird harsh frequency at like 3K. But it's not all the time. It's only on a couple notes. So if you dip that 3K out, you get a hollowness and you lose that solid, that sound up there.
Right.
So you just need to dip it out when they hit that note. So active EQ, dynamic EQ, those are all great. McDSP has a plugin called Active EQ, which is basically that. It's pretty awesome. Ozone 7, 6 probably also has dynamic EQ.
Cool.
Waves has most people don't know, the C1 Comp SC as a sidechain compressor, but that is also dynamic EQ.
That's my little Swiss Army knife compressor. I love that thing. I do that. I use that on almost anything. But before we close out, I want to ask one question that's been on my mind this whole time. What is your opinion on automating EQ moves? When I started out, I would find myself working on songs that may have a key change. And I would automate my whole EQ curve to be something completely different when the key change came in. What are your thoughts on something like that? What would you do in a situation like that?
Well, something like that, if the whole song changes, you might have to automate a bunch of different, bunch of EQs. Where it happens for me is like if you track the guitar all the way through, but there's different distortion pedals used from the verse to the chorus.
Right.
I'll usually take and split the chorus up from the verse and put them on different tracks.
Okay.
So I can just have static EQs. But yeah, automating your EQs is fine.
Something that could happen if it needs to, but
where did I just recently did it? It was I think a guitar. There was a part in the verse where a guitar played and then the vocal came in and it just didn't sound quite right without that 1 to 4K in there with the vocal. So I just EQ'd the guitar up just a little bit, little boost, 2 dB boost, and then when the vocal came in, just had it back down.
Okay.
So I just and it brought a little bit more life to that section.
That's cool. So I'm gonna have to try something like that. I don't really automate EQs much anymore, but it's definitely something that I miss from back in my younger years. But unfortunately, we gotta kind of wrap this whole show up. I've definitely learned a lot on EQs and how to approach it. what to do with an EQ, and especially the different types of EQs. I had never actually sat down myself and listened to the different textures across the SSL type and the Neve type and the API type. So thank you so much for being here, man.
Yeah.
It was a pleasure to have you.
It was great to be here. Thank you.
I really enjoyed it. I hope you all had a good time and learned a bunch. But that's gonna be it for this show this week. Thank you all for tuning in and being a part of the chat room and for watching. So until next time.